Griselda Blanco, known as La Madrina or the Godmother, was one of the most notorious and feared drug lords in history. Born in Colombia, she rose to become a key figure in the Medellín Cartel, helping to establish a major route to traffic cocaine into the United States. Her ruthless tactics and preference for violence earned her the reputation as the Queen of Narco-Trafficking during the 1970s and 1980s. But Blanco's story is more than just a tale of drugs and violence. It's a complex and often tragic story of a woman who experienced abuse and hardship from a young age, and who turned to a life of crime as a means of survival and empowerment. It's also a story that reflects the larger issues of poverty, corruption, and the failed war on drugs that have plagued Colombia and the United States for decades. In this video, we'll take a closer look at the life and crimes of Griselda Blanco, from her early years in the Medellín to her rise to power in the world of drug trafficking. We'll examine the innovative smuggling techniques she pioneered, the acts of brutal violence she ordered, and the lasting impact of her legacy on the world of organized crime. So join us as we dive into the dark and fascinating world of the Godmother of Cocaine and explore the complex forces that shaped one of the most infamous criminals of the 20th century. Warning: the following video is meant for educational purposes only and should not be taken otherwise. Apex Crime Lords does not condone, encourage, or glorify the actions of the individuals covered in this program. Viewer discretion is advised. Keep watching until the end to see what's next on Apex Crime Lords. Griselda Blanco was born on February 15, 1943, in Cartagena, Colombia. She grew up in poverty in the slums of Medellín, where she experienced a childhood marked by abuse and violence. According to some, Blanco was sexually abused by her mother's boyfriend at a young age, and she turned to a life of crime early on as a means of survival. As a teenager, Blanco became involved in the local criminal gangs, and she quickly developed a reputation as a skilled pickpocket and thief. She also became involved in prostitution and gave birth to her first child at the age of 14. In the 1960s, Blanco became involved with the Medellín Cartel, which was still in its early stages of development. She began working as a drug mule, transporting small amounts of cocaine from Colombia into the United States. But Blanco had bigger ambitions, and she quickly rose through the ranks of the cartel, thanks in part to her ruthless tactics and her ability to forge alliances with powerful figures in the criminal underworld. Blanco's rise to power was also aided by her relationship with Carlos Trujillo, a wealthy Colombian businessman who became her lover and mentor. With Trujillo's help, Blanco established herself as a major player in the cocaine trade, and she began to amass a fortune that would eventually make her one of the wealthiest women in the world. But Blanco's success came at a steep price. She became known for her violent and erratic behavior, and she was feared by even her closest associates. It's said that she once ended a man in broad daylight just because he had upset her, and she was rumored to have ordered the murders of dozens of people over the course of her criminal career. Despite the risks, Blanco continued to expand her drug empire throughout the 1970s, establishing a network of smuggling routes and distribution centers that stretched from Colombia to the United States. She also began to experiment with new and innovative ways of transporting cocaine, including hiding it in lingerie and even in the bodies of dead infants. As her wealth and power grew, Blanco became increasingly paranoid and ruthless. She surrounded herself with a team of bodyguards and assassins, and she lived in constant fear of betrayal and being stabbed in the back. But even as the walls closed in around her, Blanco remained determined to maintain her grip on the cocaine trade, no matter what the cost. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, Griselda Blanco's cocaine empire reached its height. She had established a vast network of smuggling routes and distribution centers, and each year she was raking in millions of dollars in profits. One of the keys to Blanco's success was her ability to innovate and adapt in the face of new challenges. As law enforcement agencies in the United States and Colombia began to crack down on the cocaine trade, Blanco developed new and creative ways to transport her product. She pioneered the use of lingerie as a smuggling device, hiding cocaine in the linings of bras and panties. She also began using human mules, recruiting people to swallow condoms filled with cocaine and smuggle them into the United States in their digestive tracts. Blanco was also known for her ruthless business tactics. She would often undercut her competitors by selling cocaine at a lower price, and she was not above using violence and intimidation to protect her turf. She once ordered a hit on a rival drug lord, having him gunned down in the streets of Miami. But perhaps the most infamous aspect of Blanco's criminal enterprise was her willingness to use extreme violence to maintain her power. She was known for her motorcycle assassins, hitmen who would ride up on motorcycles and eliminate their targets in broad daylight. She was also rumored to have ordered the murders of several of her own husbands and lovers, including one who reportedly met his end in a hail of machine gun fire while he was tied to a chair. Despite her fearsome reputation, Blanco was able to evade law enforcement for years, thanks in part to her network of corrupt officials and her ability to stay one step ahead of the authorities. She moved frequently, using false identities and constantly changing her appearance to avoid detection. However, by the mid-1980s, the net was starting to close in on Blanco. The United States government had begun to prioritize the war on drugs, and law enforcement agencies were putting increasing pressure on the Medellín Cartel and its leaders. In 1985, Blanco was indicted by a federal grand jury in Miami on charges of drug trafficking and racketeering. Sensing that her time was running out, Blanco fled to California, where she lived under an assumed name for several years. But in 1994, she was arrested by DEA agents and extradited to Miami to face trial. The trial was a media sensation, with prosecutors painting Blanco as a ruthless and bloodthirsty criminal mastermind. The evidence against her was overwhelming, and she was convicted on all counts. In 1998, she was sentenced to more than 2 decades in prison. But even behind bars, Blanco remained a force to be reckoned with. She continued to run her criminal enterprise from prison, using a network of loyal associates to carry out her orders. And when she was finally released in 2004, after serving only a fraction of her sentence, many feared that she would return to her old ways and reclaim her place as the queen of narco-trafficking. After her release from prison in 2004, Griselda Blanco returned to Colombia, where she attempted to rebuild her criminal empire. Despite being in her 60s and having spent several years behind bars, Blanco was still a force to be reckoned with in the world of drug trafficking. She quickly set about re-establishing her contacts and networks, reaching out to old associates and recruiting new ones to help her get back in the game. She also began to invest her vast fortune in legitimate businesses, including real estate and construction, as a way to launder her drug money and provide a cover for her illegal activities. However, the world of drug trafficking had changed significantly since Blanco's heyday in the 70s and 80s. The Medellín Cartel had been largely dismantled, and new players had emerged in the cocaine trade, including the rival Cali cartel and the growing Mexican drug cartels. Blanco also faced new challenges from law enforcement, both in Colombia and the United States. The Colombian government had become increasingly aggressive in its efforts to combat drug trafficking, and the United States had continued to prioritize the war on drugs, putting pressure on Colombia to crack down on its drug lords. Despite these obstacles, Blanco was able to maintain a significant level of power and influence in the criminal underworld. She was still feared and respected by many in the drug trade, and she was able to use her wealth and connections to stay one step ahead of the law. But Blanco's grip on power was not as strong as it once was. She was no longer the undisputed queen of narco-trafficking, and she faced increasing competition from younger, hungrier rivals who were eager to take her place. She also struggled with personal problems, including drug addiction and paranoia, and she became increasingly erratic and violent in her later years, lashing out at those around her and ordering hits on anyone she perceived as a threat. In 2012, Blanco's luck finally ran out. On September 3rd of that year, she was gunned down by 2 assassins on motorcycles as she left a butcher shop in Medellín. She was 69 years old. The murder of Griselda Blanco marked the end of an era in the world of drug trafficking. She had been one of the most notorious and feared figures in the history of the cocaine trade, a woman who had built a vast criminal empire through a combination of cunning, ruthlessness, and sheer determination. But her death also served as a reminder of the ultimate price of a life lived in the shadows of the drug world. Despite her wealth and power, Blanco had been unable to escape the cycle of violence and betrayal that had defined her criminal career. And in the end, she had fallen victim to the very forces she had helped to unleash. The fall of Griselda Blanco was a slow and powerful one, marked by a series of personal and professional setbacks that gradually eroded her power and influence in the world of drug trafficking. In the years following her release from prison in 2004, Blanco struggled to maintain her grip on the cocaine trade. The landscape of the drug world had changed significantly since her heyday in the 70s and 80s, and new players had emerged to challenge her dominance. One of the biggest threats to Blanco's power came from the Colombian government, who had become increasingly aggressive in its efforts to combat drug trafficking. In the early 2000s, the government had launched a series of military operations aimed at dismantling the country's drug cartels, and Blanco found herself in the crosshairs. She was forced to go into hiding, moving frequently to avoid detection by the authorities, and she also faced increasing pressure from rival drug lords, who saw her as a vulnerable target and sought to capitalize on her weakened position. And Blanco's personal life was also in turmoil. She had become increasingly dependent on drugs, especially cocaine, and her addiction had begun to take a toll on her health and mental well-being. She became paranoid and erratic, lashing out at those around her and ordering hits on anyone who crossed her path. In 2012, Blanco's enemies finally caught up with her. On September 3rd, she was gunned down by 2 assassins on motorcycles, on the very streets where she had grown up. The murder was a brutal reminder of the violence and betrayal that had defined Blanco's life in the drug trade. The death of Griselda Blanco marked the end of an era in the history of drug trafficking. She had been one of the most notorious and feared figures in the cocaine trade, a woman who had built a vast criminal empire through a combination of cunning, ruthlessness, and sheer force of will. But her fall from power was also a cautionary tale about the ultimate price of a life lived in the shadows of the criminal underworld. Despite her wealth and influence, Blanco had been unable to escape the cycle of violence and betrayal that had defined her career, and in the end, she had become a victim of the very forces she had helped to unleash. The legacy of Griselda Blanco is a complex and controversial one. To some, she was a folk hero, a symbol of female empowerment and resilience in the face of overwhelming odds. To others, she was a monster, a ruthless killer who had destroyed countless lives in her pursuit of power and wealth. What's clear is that Blanco's story is a reflection of the larger forces that have shaped the world of drug trafficking for decades. From the poverty and inequality that drives so many people into a life of crime, to the corruption and violence that plagues the drug trade, Blanco's rise and fall is a microcosm of the often complex, tragic realities of the illegal drug industry. Griselda Blanco's story is a complex and often disturbing one, filled with violence, betrayal, and the brutal realities of the drug world. But it's also a story that reflects the larger issues of poverty, corruption, and the failed war on drugs that have plagued Colombia and the United States for decades. At its core, Blanco's life is a testament to the incredible resilience and determination of the human spirit, even in the face of overwhelming odds. Born into poverty and abuse, she managed to rise to become one of the most powerful and feared figures in the world of organized crime, and she built a vast empire that spanned continents and generated millions of dollars. But Blanco's story is also a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked ambition and the corrupting influence of power. Her ruthless tactics and willingness to use violence to achieve her goals ultimately led to her downfall, and she became a target for law enforcement and from rival drug lords. In the end, Blanco's legacy is also a complicated one. She was a pioneering figure in the world of drug trafficking, a woman who broke barriers and challenged the male-dominated hierarchy of the cocaine trade. But she was also a deeply flawed and troubled individual, whose actions caused immeasurable harm to countless individuals and communities. As we reflect on the life and times of Griselda Blanco, it's important to remember the larger forces that shaped her story. From the poverty and inequality that drove her to a life of crime, to the corruption and violence that defined the drug trade, Blanco's rise and fall is a microcosm of the complex and often tragic realities of the war on drugs. But it's also a reminder of the incredible resilience and strength of the human spirit, even in the darkest of circumstances. Blanco's story is one of survival and perseverance, of a woman who refused to be defined by her circumstances and who fought tooth and nail to build a life for herself and her family. In the end, the legacy of Griselda Blanco is one that will continue to fascinate and horrify us to equal measure. She was a woman who lived life on her own terms, who defied the odds and challenged the status quo at every turn. But she was also deeply flawed and troubled, whose actions had devastating consequences for all those who crossed her path. Let's remember Griselda Blanco as neither hero nor villain, but as a complex and deeply human figure, whose story is a reflection of the best and worst of our shared humanity. and let us use her legacy as a call to action, to work towards a better, more just, and more compassionate world for all. Thank you for joining us into this deeper look into one of the most infamous underworld figures of our time. If you found it illuminating, be sure to like this video and subscribe to Apex Crime Lords for more unvarnished portraits of the mobsters, killers, and kingpins who have left their bloody mark on history. Until next time, stay safe and stay dangerous. Up next, from the streets of Detroit to the heights of hip-hop royalty, one man's rise to power would forever change the face of organized crime. Big Meech and the Black Mafia family built an empire on cocaine, cash, and celebrity, but at what cost? Join us next time as we untangle the web of ambition, greed, and betrayal that would ultimately bring down one of the most notorious drug trafficking organizations in history. This is the story of Big Meech, DMF, and the high price of the American dream.